everybody, and welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, Jay By The Way.
Yay, Jay.
Today, I'm going to be talking about John C. Lilly and his most famous experiment, Tony. This is a topic that gets brought up on the internet and mentioned in about 2 sentences, and I wanted to dig in and find the story. Before we do get into detail, I want to warn people, we are going to continue our policy of no swears on the show, but this is an adult topic, okay? We will be discussing some mature themes in this episode, so if you would rather your young children or old children or you yourself not hear about that, you have been warned.
We're going to be talking a lot about drugs as well as some sexual acts with dolphins.
Yes. I mentioned earlier John C. Lilly. John C. Lilly was a doctor who, by the time that we get to his story, is already incredibly accomplished. He has done a lot of work on trying to understand animal behavior. He has hooked primates up to electrodes to figure out how stimulating their brain changes their behavior. He is very, very interested in the relationship between the brain and reality and how the brain interprets what we see around us and how we experience reality. He's the inventor of the sensory deprivation chamber, and by the time we catch up with him, this guy is over 50 years old, and he's got a dream. His dream is that he wants to talk to dolphins. He'd become interested in dolphin communications in the 1950s after observing that dolphin brains were larger than human brains. And so he started doing experiments with these dolphins. He put 2 dolphins in separate tanks and opened what he called a telephone between them, so all the contact that they had was auditory. And he realized that when the dolphins were able to hear each other, even if they couldn't see each other, they would carry on these really long conversations. His account of these conversations is actually fascinating to me. He talked about how there's 2 different dolphin modes of communication. They have whistles and clicks, and they're able to converse in both at the same time. So, for instance, one dolphin can send clicks while the other dolphin sends whistles, but they won't ever interrupt each other on the same wavelength. So while one dolphin is sending clicks, the other one will not interrupt him more or less with a clicking pattern, but he will send whistle patterns to the other dolphin who will also not interrupt that. It's like they're having 2 separate conversations, and this has almost nothing to do with what we're going to get into later, but I just thought that was fascinating, Tony.
Well, you could see why he would be so fascinated by it. Like, especially a guy who's done so much with animal behavior, and up to this point in the 50s and 60s, there hadn't been many attempts to really understand what dolphins were trying to say with all this.
And it's important to remember at this point that he's way out on a limb already. So today we understand that dolphins are pretty intelligent animals, all right? We can't exactly measure how intelligent, but we are understanding of the fact that they've got big brains. They've probably got some pretty complex inner lives. They may not quite be able to match humans, but they're not just nothing. But by the time John C. Lilly is coming on the scene, that is not common knowledge. Fishermen are just annoyed at dolphins because sometimes they'll steal their catch, and there's no sort of larger understanding of these things as intelligent, playful, communicative creatures. They're just sort of pests in the sea that maybe will help you if you get attacked by a shark. And John C. Lilly is pretty much single-handedly responsible for a lot of what we understand about dolphins today. But he's still a little bit crazy.
Just a little bit.
How crazy was John C. Lilly? Well, here's his plan. He figures, okay, dolphins, they can make sounds with their mouths. Sometimes they'll even make sounds that sound like human sounds. They'll do something that it's essentially like mocking how humans speak. So if you make a certain sound and a dolphin can make that sound, he'll do a similar kind of thing. I've never heard it, so that might not be exactly right, but they are capable of vocalizations that are human-esque. And so John C. Lilly says, okay, so they can mimic some human vocal sounds. What if they are communicating with each other in the same way that we're communicating with each other? Could we possibly be able to tap into dolphin oral histories passed down through the oceans for untold millennia? And this is a real plan that he had. Maybe could we not send a dolphin to the United Nations to have a seat on the United Nations to speak on the behalf of dolphins from around the world? Real plan. John Lilly.
That's jumping a little ahead, I would think, of what they're capable of. Even if they had near human level intelligence, that's a big jump.
Yeah, well, John Lilly made the jump. Boy, he jumped all the way into the pool with both feet, and there was dolphins in the pool. And again, remember, if that sounds crazy now, at the time, nobody was thinking about dolphins as hyper-intelligent animals, right? At least on the upper tiers of what animals are capable of for intelligence, if not on human level. So for John C. Lilly to be like, here's this fish, guys. Now, I know dolphins aren't fish, don't write me. But for the sake of the sort of dumbing down of the argument, John C. Lilly says, here's these fish. They can kind of make a noise. Let's teach them to speak English, and then they can be in the UN.
For a scientist to just do it, it's kind of awesome. I fully support this.
Well, you fully support this, and here's the great thing, Tony. Because this was the 1960s, NASA also fully supported this idea.
There were a lot of interesting things happening at this time. Like he's also friends with noted psychonauts Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna and all this, and you can kind of understand where some of these ideas are coming from once you know that.
It's also not just the crazy people. He's also good friends with Carl Sagan at the time.
Terence McKenna wasn't crazy. He was just out there.
Okay, well, we'll get into the psychonaut stuff. That actually hasn't happened at this point in the story, Tony. That's the bizarre part. John Lilly, who will later be known as LSD fiend, trippin' man, talking to weird cosmic entities who he has made contact through telepathy through his LSD trips, has not yet dropped acid when he starts this project.
That's surprising to me.
So, he has his money, and he sets up a new lab on the Caribbean island of St. Thomas. And to this lab, he ships in 3 dolphins. There's 2 females named Pamela and Sissy, and there's a male named Peter. And John Lilly sets about trying to teach these dolphins how to speak the English language. And early in the process, there's a young local woman named Margaret Lovett who comes up to the lab, and she's just sort of curious about what's going on. Like, she knocks on the door, and the director of the lab, whose name was Gregory Bateson, also a very influential and smart scientist who would later fall out with John Lilly, he comes to the door, and she starts asking questions about what they're doing, and Gregory Bateson says, well, come in and see. And she goes in and starts doing animal observations with the researchers, and they find that even though she was not formally trained, she's actually really good at picking up on specific quirks of their behavior. And because of this sort of natural affinity for the dolphins and how they're acting, she is able to get a job here at the lab. She goes to work trying to teach these dolphins how to speak English. But as she threw herself into the work, Margaret Lovett became convinced that the lab wasn't going far enough. She said, quote, every night we would all get in our cars and pull the garage door down and drive away, and I thought, well, there's this big brain floating around all night. It amazed me that everybody kept leaving, and I just thought it was wrong. And her solution to this problem, that everybody leaves the lab at night, was to petition the lab director to build a special room in the lab where she would be able to sleep above the water. She had a bed that sort of hung over the pool. She had a desk that also hung from the ceiling, and she would essentially spend all of her time in what you would describe maybe as a cohabitat with one of these dolphins, really trying to integrate herself into their lives, and maybe through that be able to make enough of a connection to inspire them to make these vocalizations they were trying to get them to make.
It makes a weird sort of sense, like, or at least I can see her logic, despite the fact that they just don't have the vocal cords to be able to do this.
Well, again, they have a limited amount of ability to do some of this. Like, they're not completely unable to make any human vocalization, just not to the level that John C. Lilly wanted them to. And one of the interesting things that I encountered studying this was the question of why was John Lilly so obsessed with teaching dolphins the English language? Because it's obvious that they already have some form of communication between them. We can't know at this point exactly how complex that communication is, but it appears to be more than just food here and runaway bad thing. So I wondered why John Lilly didn't try to learn dolphin language, and in fact, some of the people at the lab kept trying to convince John Lilly maybe to try to learn dolphin language, and he just never got on that train. He was fixated on this idea that they were going to speak English, and spoilers, but it don't happen, guys. This story does not end with dolphins talking.
If you were to do this an opposite way and you had like a computer tracking all these different phrases that are repeated and try to like match it up with certain behaviors, if you could honestly figure out a little bit of what dolphins are trying to say now. Because it's not like primates can't do sign language and such. They have a basic understanding of what language is with that. Like, I feel like there might be something more to this that you could figure out now, but they say so much of animal communication is more than just the sounds they make, but in the movements that they make. So it might be a combination of the sounds plus movement plus everything else with these dolphins. Like, they might not have been getting the full conversation to the other dolphin in the other tank because they couldn't see the movements.
That's also a good point. Although it is interesting to note, again, that they will have these conversations only as long as the audio line is open. So if they're alone and there's no way to communicate with another dolphin, they'll just be silent. They have a little thing that they'll chirp out that people think might be something like a name, or sort of like a "here I am and this is who I am" kind of a chirp that they'll make every once in a while if they're by themselves. But they do tend to try to communicate through audio only somehow. Like, again, I don't know if it's complete communication, but they're doing something there.
Yeah.
We mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth pointing out that this is the point where John Lilly starts taking LSD. Again, he had always had this interest in the brain's relationship to reality. There was one source that I found that said he got this from an early age when he saw his mother have brain surgery done on her. I was not able to find corroborating evidence for that, but there was another article that said that he had visions as a young child that heavily influenced how he saw the world. He knew that the brain's representation of reality could be flawed, and so he was always interested in researching that, which is why before this he had developed the sensory deprivation chamber, where he had already had some kind of mind trips, and now he starts experimenting with LSD. And when he took LSD, it unlocked what Lilly believed were the secrets of the universe. In his LSD trips, he encountered a cosmic organization that he called Earth Coincidence Control Office, or ECHO for short, ECCO. And if you're wondering, does this have anything to do with the mid-90s game for Sega, Echo the Dolphin? Yes. Yes, it does. That's where that game got its name, from John Lilly's weird hallucinogenic LSD trips and also his work with dolphins.
And also that game is trippy. Like, it's very, very trippy. You're not just like a dolphin doing cool stuff under the water and like killing bosses. You're also traveling to like parallel dimensions and fighting off giant squid monsters and all sorts of other weird things.
Which is just what you would expect for a game inspired by a 1960s LSD drug trip with dolphins.
Yes. Honestly, that game was a big part of my childhood.
I have nothing bad to say about it. I haven't played it, but all the stuff I read was from people who said that it was pretty good. Meanwhile, while John Lilly is off taking LSD, Margaret Lovett is now installed in her specially built human dolphin cohabitat, and she's continuing the process of trying to teach Peter the dolphin how to speak. She is not, as far as I can tell, taking any LSD. She's just doing the work that she's there to do. And it's difficult work because, as you mentioned earlier, dolphins not really built for human speech. She spent so much of her time just trying to get Peter to say the words, "Hello, Margaret." But according to her, quote, "M was very difficult. My name, hello, Margaret. I worked on the M sound, and he eventually rolled over to bubble it through the water. That M, he worked on it so hard."
Huh.
So at the very least, she was getting him to try to mimic her, to find a way to make the sound that she was trying to get him to make. But they ran into a problem, Tony. And if you've heard about the LSD part of this, you've also heard about the other part of this research, which is that Peter was an adolescent male dolphin, and adolescent male dolphins, much like adolescent male humans, can have certain urges. He starts presenting Ms. Lovett with an erection. Dolphin penis gets hard. Fascinating thing about this, by the way, dolphins can get an erection on command, apparently. They don't have to get in the mood. There's no, lighting the candles or anything. If they want to get hard, they're just there. It's like 2 seconds and they're gone.
Yeah, that's adolescent teen boys, too.
What I'm saying is it's not fully sexual, at least according to some of the stuff that I read. Like, apparently, if you want to swim with dolphins, sometimes they'll just be like, well, here you go. Here's a handle for you to hang on to, I guess. I'm not using it right now. Just grab on there. And so Peter starts rolling over, right, showing himself to Margaret. And initially what they do is what you would assume a sane person would do, right? They take him to the other tank with the female dolphins, put him in there, he does his thing with the other lady dolphins, and then he's good to go back up to learn more English. But you got to remember, the whole point of the reason that she's living in a house that's built for a dolphin and a human to live together is because she's trying to get this immersion, right? And every time that Peter gets toted downstairs to do his thing with the other dolphins and then gets toted back upstairs, that's lost time for this research that is not going to be going on forever. And so Margaret says, okay, listen, rather than him toting down to his girlfriends down there, why don't I just take care of this? He's got a dolphin penis, I've got a hand. We'll just relieve that tension. I will read now her quote about this. She said, "I wasn't uncomfortable with it as long as it wasn't rough. It would just become part of what was going on, like an itch to get rid of it. Just get rid of it, scratch it, and move on. And that's how it seemed to work out. It wasn't private. People could observe it. It wasn't sexual on my part, sensuous perhaps. It seemed to me that it made the bond closer, not because of the sexual activity, but because of the lack of having to keep breaking. And that's really all it was."
Not to mention, it might be kind of risky to haul a dolphin up the stairs or downstairs and all that. I'm trying to figure out the layout of their lab and how that would work.
I don't fully know what the layout was. It seemed like it was a difficult thing to get him to a different place in the lab for the other. I said downstairs. It might not have been like stairs, but you know what I'm saying. Like they had to get him out of one pool into another pool. It's just, it's a time sink from her perspective. I have tried to figure out exactly how I feel about this, like from a moral perspective. On the one hand, reading her account, I was able to see, like, I could see how this person could justify this to themselves. And I can come up with some justifications too, all right? Like, if you're, a cattle farmer and you're, some bulls are kept for breeding and, got to get that semen out somehow. And same thing with horses. And like, nobody looks down their noses at that. They might think of it as a little unsavory, but there's no insinuation that something gross is going on.
Yeah, it's like the vast majority of cattle are actually done through artificial means.
Right. On the other hand, dolphins aren't cattle. Like, the whole point of this story is that they're of higher intelligence, and Peter seems to have developed some kind of specific attachment to Miss Lovett, so you're welcome to be as disgusted as you feel like being about this story. I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. I don't think it's what I would do. I will say that. But I don't read this and think like, that Margaret Lovett is some kind of weird
dolphin pervert.
Yes. Unfortunately, while Ms. Lovett might not have thought of the act as sexual, that didn't stop the editors of Hustler magazine from running a story about the woman and the dolphin called Interspecies Sex, Humans and Dolphins that brought lots of unfavorable attention to the experiment. Somehow Hustler finds out about this, and again, as she says, they weren't necessarily trying to keep it secret, but they think, well, we've got something here. We can draw a picture of a lady and a dolphin kind of swimming together and write this whole thing up, and our fan base will just eat this up. And they sure did. And that was kind of the beginning of the end. Because, again, if you've heard of this story, this is the thing you've heard about. You've heard about dolphin handjobs. It's essentially like those two words just put together might as well be internet shorthand for this entire story. That's all you need to say. And somebody's like, oh yeah, I heard about that. And then the guy did LSD, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's secondary that he used to get on LSD, get in an isolation tank, and try to understand the dolphins. Like, people focus on that aspect less than a girl relieve the tension of a dolphin.
Well, there's another aspect that also gets mentioned in internet lore, and that's what we're going to get to next, which is John C. Lilly, now in the sort of thrall of LSD, he says LSD is great. This is doing wonders for me. It's opening up my mind and allowing me to think in ways that I'd never thought before. Maybe it'll be good for the dolphins too. So, he gives the dolphins LSD in the hopes, let us not forget, that it will allow them to speak English so that one day they can have a seat on the United Nations.
I bet he was one of those proponents of the stoned ape theory.
Well, it is worth noting that animals from insects to elephants have all engaged in intentional mind-altering behavior. Things that, at least to any observer from the outside, sure do look like seeking out something that changes the way your brain understands the world. Elephants have gotten into people's alcohol before, and they will get drunk.
If you go to a lot of resorts, monkeys actually have preferences for the drinks they steal.
Yep. There are birds also that will eat fermented berries specifically so that they will get drunk. And as we're talking about dolphins in this story, there's recent research that indicates that dolphins intentionally bite down on the poisonous spines of the pufferfish in order to get high. Normally kills people. Dolphins doesn't kill, just makes them feel good. But in spite of how much you might argue that there were good intentions here and that these scientists were misunderstood, public opinion started to turn, and with public opinion went the funding. The funding dried up, and the lab in St. Thomas was closed. Now, the dolphins were moved to another facility in Florida, but the pools they were given to stay in were much, much smaller, and they didn't have any access to sunlight. And sadly, Peter the dolphin committed suicide by choosing not to breathe. Dolphins don't have to breathe like humans. I mean, they have to breathe, but it isn't automatic for them. They actually intentionally breathe every time that they come up for a breath. And so they are able to just stop if they want to. And that's what Peter did. and he died.
It's a rough way to go. Just suffocating yourself.
It's also worth noting that this is not the first time John Lilly would have been involved in dolphin deaths. One of his first experiments was putting electrodes in dolphin brains, but he didn't know how to properly anesthetize them. So they just drowned while he was trying to do surgery on them. There are several things that he accidentally does killing dolphins that don't really put him in the best light as a dolphin researcher and lover. It's a weird tightrope to walk where, on the one hand, he definitely does respect them as animals and even possibly as equals, but on the other hand, he gonna do things that might kill them and do kill them on several occasions. So, kind of a double standard.
Yeah, that's a pretty rough one. I imagine that you'd have to have some sort of forced respiration if you were going to operate on a dolphin.
John Lilly never stopped trying to communicate with dolphins. He tried almost everything from LSD-induced telepathy to a special computer-generated language. The one thing he never did try, though, was actually learning the dolphins' language. And this is maybe the most unfortunate thing about this whole story. As we mentioned, there is some really interesting complexity in the language of dolphins. We are able to observe this. We don't fully understand it, and it's possible that one of the reasons we don't yet understand it better is because of the taint that John Lilly put on dolphin language research with his actions. With the weird dolphin sex scandal, with the LSD that he was giving them, he essentially made this a quack field for a long time. And I'm not necessarily super anti-LSD. It seems like, from things that I've heard, it could have some positive uses in psychological treatments of various addictions and phobias and things like that. But it didn't do any favors for the people who would have liked to research the language of dolphins without being labeled as kooks.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, he probably should have used a little more moderation in what he was doing with the LSD. Although I am wondering, how did the dolphins react on LSD? Did they even have a chemical reaction to it?
They had some reaction. Several of the articles I read said they just didn't do anything for them, but I found others that said that they just kind of got a little bit more mellow and swam a little differently. And that was really all that we were able to tell. It wasn't completely without effect, but it was not a successful experiment if your goal was to get these things talking.
Yeah.
But that is all I have for John C. Lilly and his experiments in teaching dolphins English. I think that this dude is a fascinating character. I don't agree with many of his decisions, but the trajectory that his life took is fascinating to me. He wrote many books, first about dolphins and later on about LSD. I think he went pretty far off the garden path. I think probably he got so far into LSD that he didn't know what was actually real anymore, and that seems like a bad idea. But he was a weird character, and I actually want to look more into his life. But this little chapter is maybe what he's best known for.
Yeah, despite the fact that he should probably be more well known for his isolation tanks and things of that nature, this one stands out because of absurdity.
Yep. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you like this episode, don't forget to tell a friend about it. And also, if you want to help support the show, you can go over to patreon.com/humanechoes. If you become a patron over there, you can get a shout out at the beginning of the show. You get access to our bonus podcast and lots of other cool stuff. And we'll see you guys next time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.